So in this video, we're going to deal with the particle simulation, and this is the link between the trawler and the ocean. It's what's going to give the impression that this trawler is kind of ploughing its way through the ocean. Now, what I'm not trying to do here is create some kind of physically accurate fluid simulation. Because the boat is in the distance, all I'm really after is the impression of spray and waves. So we've already got the two important pieces of geometry relating to the simulation in the schematic. We've got the trawler footprint, which is going to act as the emitter, and the trawler wake, which is going to help us to control the particles. So first thing we need is a surface emitter. So I'll load that in and add that to the schematic. Let's just bring the simulation in as well. And then we'll just link the footprint to the emitter. And then if I click on the sim button, see we're getting some particles emitted from that geometry. So as the boat is moving through the water, I want the particles to be thrown up into the air, and then gravity will take effect and bring them back down into the water. So if I go to the surface emitter, we need a good initial velocity. So I'm going to increase that to 4 meters per second, and I'm just going to increase the emission rate as well so we can see more particles whilst we're working things out. And then if we go to the particle simulation, we check use gravity, and I also want to cull the particles after a certain length of time, because these particles are going to be created and then they're going to drop back through the ocean surface. So once they pass through that ocean surface, we don't need to see them anymore. So I'm going to cull by age, and I'll set the minimum age to 50 frames. Now what I meant to say there was maximum age. My brain's playing tricks on me. So what we want to do next is use the wake to control the shape of those particles. Let's just run the sim. You can see we're getting the particles created, but they're just kind of bobbling around, not really doing much. So to control those particles with these curves, we need to add a curve force. We'll add that in. And we need to link the wake to that curve force. So let's run it again. And you can see the particles are now starting to move with the curve. Now we can increase the radius around that curve in which the particles will be affected. So let's increase the radius to 2.5 meters. And try it again. And you can see they're really moving in the direction of the curve now. There's still a little bit of randomization, but you can see there's a definite direction to their movement. Now at sea, there'd also be wind affecting the spray. So this time I'm going to add a wind force, and we'll load that in. So we'll just set that in there. Now, we need to determine the direction for that wind. So I'm just going to move it over here and rotate it around, rotate it by 90 degrees, so it's going across the sea. If we just look at the locator there, you can see it's pointed in the same direction as the waves. I don't want it to be in exactly the same direction, so let's rotate it on the Y by minus 10 degrees. Now the strength of this wind is very important, because if it's too strong, it's just going to blow these particles away completely. So we want just a kind of suggestion of some wind. So let's set the velocity to 4 meters per second. And also that wind needs to gust, because it's going to be a stormy day. So to add some randomization to that, we can select the strength channel, bring that into the schematic, and then if we add a channel noise modifier, we can just hook the output of that into the strength. So we're just going to randomize that 4 meter per second wind speed. So I've just cached a small section of the sim. If I hit play, you see the particles are being blown slightly by the wind, But as the boat crashes down here, you can see how the particles are kind of not being thrown forward. They're following the curves too rigidly. So what I'm going to do is go back to the curve force and just reduce the strength to 50%. Now let's run the sim again. So if I just scrub that through now, you can see as the boat crashes down, you can see the particles get thrown forward now, and then the wind kind of blows them back a little bit. So I'm quite happy with that as it stands. Now, in order for this to look believable or give the impression that there's a lot of water churning around, we're going to need a lot of particles. So let's just get rid of that cache simulation. And if I select the surface emitter, I'm going to change the emission rate to 100,000. So I've just cached the first 100 frames of the scene. You can see we're getting a much nicer impression now of the water churning around the boat. Now the problem with this at the moment is this simulation is being stored with the scene. So if I was to cache the entire 1,000 frames, or 950 frames, this would be a very large scene on disk. So instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is save the simulation to a CSV point cache. So I've just got rid of that stored simulation, and then we go to Add Particles and choose CSV point cache, and then all we've got to do is link that to point cache on the particle simulation. And then if we go to, also if we select the CSV point cache, we can click New Sequence, and then we can select a folder where we want to save it. Hit Save. And now all we have to do is cache the entire simulation. And as we do that, if I hit OK, as we do that, you can see the CSV files being created. So when that's done, and it'll take a while, you'll have your particles safely stored somewhere else on disk, and the actual scene itself will be quite light. You can see that we're getting a nice impression of a wake around the boat. Now the problem with it at the moment is if I scrub to another frame, there's quite a long delay as Modo kind of clears one cache and then has to load in another file for that frame. But if we're working on another part of the scene, all we have to do is hide the CSV point cache, and the scene is as quick as it was before. So in addition to the wake around the boat, it might also be nice in this scene, because the boat is actually battling through a storm, it would be nice to have a lot of spray in the scene coming off the tops of the waves. So again, we can do that with another particle simulation. So I'm going to start by loading in a surface particle generator. I'll just add that into the schematic. And we want the ocean to be the source of the particles. So I'm just going to link the ocean to the surface particle generator. Now you can see all the particles clustered together in the corner of the ocean there. And the reason for that is the average spacing is too small. So if we select the surface particle generator and up the average spacing to say 2 meters, we've now got particles all over the ocean. Now we want the particles just to be clustered around the tops of these waves, and we can do that by modulating the placement of those particles based on the height of the waves. So if we come down to distribution, we can change the density gradient input to y distance to locator. So it's going to look from the ground plane upwards, and then we just need to change the graph. So if we select this key, I'm going to set that to 5 meters and 0. And I'm going to create another key. So when the waves hit 10 meters, I want the value to be 100. And now you see all those points are congregated on the top of the waves, and as the animation runs, that distribution changes. So I just want to change the shape of this curve a little bit because I want them to be congregated more towards the top. So I'm just going to change the shape of that curve. There we go. So I just want to increase the density of those particles. So I'll reduce the average spacing to 500 millimeters. And now we've got a lot more particles. Now what we're going to do is use this surface particle generator, or these particles on top of the waves, as individual emission sources in their own right. So these points are determining where the particles are going to get generated, and the particles are going to fly off from the tops of the waves. So to do that, we need something called a source emitter. So I'll load that into the scene. I want to disconnect it from this simulation. We need to connect it to the surface particle generator, and then we need to connect that to a simulation of its own. So if we add another simulation, add that, and then link those two together. Okay, so let's adjust some of these settings. So the emission rate needs to be quite high. We need a lot of particles to be generated. So let's up that to 6,000. And I also want the particles to kind of lift into the air slightly as they're created. So I'm just going to increase the initial velocity to 1 meter per second. And then if we go to the particle simulation, we definitely want to cull by age. We don't once they've disappeared through the ocean surface, we don't need to see them anymore. So I'm just going to set the maximum age to 100 frames. And I want to use the gravity because we need them to fall back towards the ocean. But I don't want them to fall back too quickly. So I'm going to use gravity and set the acceleration to -1. Now what's going to give the impression of it being a stormy day is to have these particles flying past the camera. So they need to be wind driven. Now we've already got wind in the scene, but that was made specifically for the wake simulation. We didn't want to have the wind too strong. So what we can do is have a second wind item that's only affecting this new simulation. So we go to particles and add another wind force. That links into the new particle simulation. Importantly, we want it to have the same orientation as the other wind. So if we select both of those wind forces, got set up, we can hit item position and item rotation. So it's matched the position and rotation of the first wind force. Now we want the wind to be a lot stronger this time. So let's set the velocity to 15 meters per second. And again, we want it to be modulated by a noise. So I'll bring in the strength channel, and we can just use the same channel noise that we've got in the scene for the other wind. So I'll just link that in. Now before we run any kind of simulation, it's important to remember that we've got two simulations in the scene. And this wake simulation has already been taken care of. We've already cached everything. Now to be honest, the elements of that simulation don't even have to be in the scene anymore because everything's been driven by the point from the point cache, or being read from the point cache. But it's good to leave the nodes in there in case we need them, or in case we need to change something. So before I run a simulation for this new particle simulation, I'm just going to select the wake simulation and disable it. So then we can go in and cache a couple of 100 frames to see what we've got. So with that done, if I just hide the surface particle generator and then scrub through the animation, you can see now we've got these particles flying off the top of those waves. So again, I want to keep the scene as small as possible, so I'm going to create another CSV point cache. So let's just clear the sim. And if we create another CSV point cache, link that into that simulation. I'm going to create a new sequence. And now we can sim the whole thing. So with the simulation complete, we can now start to think about what it's all going to look like when it's rendered.